Welcome to Perspectives El Paso. I'm Professor Leon Blevins of El Paso Community College Television. I have a special program today on deaf education, education for the hearing impaired. Last December, my wife Shanna and I were at Bassett Place for a Santa Claus, signing Santa Claus program for the hearing impaired. And we've been attending those kind of programs and participating in them going back many years, back to at least to the 1980s. And at that particular meeting last year, we met Mr. Jason Lilly. Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
And so I have Jason Lilly with me today. He's now the director for this program in El Paso. And I could tell you story after story after story, but it really is his program. And as we go along, I may throw in a few things about how we have plugged into this, because my wife worked in this field for 27 years before she retired in 1999. Jason, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me on.
It took a while to get this worked out because of my schedule and your schedule, and I could not actually work it in for Shanna and Lanil Bowling, who helped start the program in El Paso, to be on the show today. But I'm going to reserve a couple of minutes at the end and show them talking about how this program that you're now head of began here in El Paso.
Yes.
So tell me about you. Where are you from? Where did you go to school? How did you get into this field of deaf education?
Sure. It's actually very interesting. I'm originally from Odd, West Virginia. So I grew up on a farm. My family were coal miners. Mm-hmm. But when I was 20 years old, I came out to New Mexico State University and started working towards a degree in anthropology. Actually, so that's, Southwest archaeology is one of my passions.
Yes.
Living in the Southwest was important to me, and to get that experience. So I moved out here at 20 and just started working and getting that experience. My grandmother was hard of hearing herself. She wore hearing aids all growing up, but I never thought about...
I had a grandmother who was basically deaf. She didn't have a hearing aid for a long time and moved to California, where they were more willing to help pay for a hearing aid for her.
Well, my grandmother had the hearing aids, but they just didn't work for her very well, so she did a lot more lip reading. You could even hear her. I remember hearing her hearing aids squeal from the other side of the trailer that she lived in. So
Yes.
She did very well when it was one-on-one, but she did lip reading. But when it was, a group of people, I always thought about her and how she didn't have access to the family because she didn't sign.
Oh, so you were sensitized to that, and you find yourself here. And
Yes.
then how did you transition over? You needed a job, so you started teaching, or what?
Yeah, so I was always interested in teaching. Since I was a little kid, I was always interested in becoming a teacher. In fact, I eventually had wanted to become a university professor, even through anthropology. Mm-hmm. But I started substitute teaching, and then at the time, it's interesting that you talked about the signing Santa. A friend of mine, when I worked in Albuquerque, and a friend of mine in Albuquerque introduced me to the speech therapist, Lori Lell, who was with the Regional Day School Program for the Deaf. Mm-hmm. And I met Lori and the director at the time at Bassett Center for the Signing Santa.
Right. Well, I turned into an elf for that program. I used to loan them my Santa suit. Finally, they were able to they got a grant from Community Foundation, bought their own Santa suit and so on. So I turned in a dancing elf for the kids when they do the Signing Santa program.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Well, see, I just went to kind of take a look at the program, fell in love with all of it, and by August, I had done everything I needed to do. Started going to school at Texas Tech. I took classes at Texas Tech over the summer to kind of get my. I had already had a master's degree in special education at that time.
Okay.
But got some more information. Took 3 courses over the summer so that I could get information on becoming a certified deaf education teacher, and started working on under a probationary certification.
Well, I told Laurie, I talked to her on the phone yesterday about this program. I said I'd let her know when it's going to be on air, and she got all excited, and she told me a little bit about this route that you had taken in her little context with it. And I have a picture in my files of her at a Signing Santa event, so I hope we can weave that into the program.
Sounds great. And so ever since I've been here, I taught in an oral deaf program at. So I worked with the oral deaf for 3 years, working with anywhere from pre-K all the way up to 5th grade. Did that for 3 years, and then I transitioned over to middle school, and I worked in a TC program. We did signed English, My sign language skills were not that great at the time, so they did give me an interpreter, and I started learning from the interpreter and the kids. I also took some courses at community college to learn some sign language as well. Did that for 3 years, and then 5 years ago I became the program director. So.
Well, you work with a great interpreter, Margie Tarango.
Yes, sir.
Good friend of ours that works out of Burgess, and she's been signing for the Signing Santa program for years to help some people there that they're not aware of what is happening.
Sure, and all the interpreters in our program, they've all been there since before I got there. So I've been now in the program for 11 years, and they've all, my entire staff has helped me along my transition through the program too, going from oral deaf to a signing deaf population to now program director. So it's a big family is what it is.
Well, I like that word, family, because we, on 2 different occasions, we had young Hispanic males live with us, very profoundly deaf, and our children got involved in it, eventually began to help out and do things. Our daughter was a teacher at Rosa Guerrero School, and they started working out to take Christmas things, trees and presents to very low-income people, and then it spread to the church that we were attending. Don't you find that with the work of deaf education, it just spreads out in a broad way like that?
Absolutely. I mean, particularly with the services that we provide, we start services from birth with some of these families and some of these kids. So when you start, working with a child that's just been born, maybe they're only 6 weeks old or 6 months old, and they're going through that schooling process from that age all the way up through. It's such a small group of individuals that you do become friends with family members. You see them out in the community. They ask you questions about things that they may not even feel comfortable asking their own parents about in particular, because if you're the person who signs to them, you're the person who knows their language skills, and they don't have that same connection with some other members of their family, you become like extended family for a lot of kids.
Well, Linnell Bowling and my wife Shanna Blevins both had the same experience of going into the homes and teaching not only sign language to all family members, not just the handicapped one or the disabled one, but working with the whole family. And as it turns out, some of those family members later get into the field of deaf education, and they themselves become teachers.
Absolutely, and I see that a lot in my staff. So I have parents on staff that became paraprofessionals, then an interpreter, then a teacher, and so yes, I see that all the time where family members, they're kind of thrown into the field because of their child, but they really take that initiative to go and get all that extra education so that they can be the advocate for their child, but also the advocate for other children as well.
Now, there were times that I would go with Shanna to places that were pretty dangerous in the evenings.
Sure.
That she felt uncomfortable with going alone, so I would go with her, and I would sit there in the rooms. Some of them just had one electrical outlet, in South El Paso particularly, one electrical outlet, a radio, TV set, and a light bulb. That's about it. I didn't see magazines, newspapers, or any of those things. Now, put here as a centerpiece some books.
Sure.
Isn't that important that you start them very, very young to learning about books, and you can use picture books to teach them language skills?
Absolutely, particularly with our baby population. One of the things that I do is I always try to leave some funding set aside just for that teacher so that we can start providing books to families, so that we can start providing some of those materials. So she actually has this whole room of materials that she can take out to the homes, working with those kiddos, 0 to 3. But technology has changed so much too. So we're using books, but we're also using tablets and other types of technology devices.
This right here.
Yes, sir.
The cell phone. One of the deaf children that lived with us, we visited with him and his family. Now the kids are grown in his family, in Amarillo, and they were talking about texting to each other. Yes. Because the man, he's now an adult, deaf, but the others in the family are hearing, but they can communicate also with texting. It's a wonderful tool now, electronics.
Yes, absolutely. And most kids, at least in schools today, at least by middle school, have a cell phone. And yeah, that's exactly how a lot of communication happens, at Ross Middle School and at Burgess High School between deaf and hearing peers.
Well, you're wearing a shirt that says Burgess. Tell me about your shirt.
Sure. So this is actually, we were looking for ways to, every year we buy a shirt for our program, and we usually buy it The staff usually we find a t-shirt company and we design and we buy a t-shirt from them. But last year I had talked and thought about it, and I talked to my staff, and so what we did is this year we did something a little different. This shirt was actually designed by the deaf and hard of hearing students at Burgess High School, which is where our program is. Yeah. So they designed the shirt. We then took the design, had the shirts made, but we also incorporated a lot of other things into our senior math class, where we talked about, okay, this shirt costs us this much money to make. Mm-hmm. So if it costs us $3.50 to make this t-shirt, now how much should we charge to, for them to buy this shirt? September in particular is Deaf and Hard of Hearing Month.
Okay.
So it's so we wanted to talk about deaf history, deaf culture, and as a way of helping to support that, we created the t-shirt. My students created the t-shirt. I personally bought the first set, so we needed our startup capital. So I told them, I'll put in the $250 for the startup capital, right? So I'll buy the first set of t-shirts for you. But now you have to remember, I'm only buying the first set. So from that point on, you have to be able to make enough money to have a profit and buy your next box of t-shirts.
So they're learning a lot of different things.
Yes, absolutely. And so the whole goal in mind is, how can we raise money to go on some senior trips if they want to go to, say, Texas Celebration in Dallas for deaf and hard of hearing artists? How can we then take and have them learn how to raise their own money for some events that they want to go on as a club? So they created their own club. We went through the process of creating their own club and learning how to do all of these different life skills that they can take with them, for learning how to start up a business, basically, is what they're learning how to do.
You use the word trip. I used to go with my wife to various locations, such as the zoo.
Yes.
And I ended up with a zoo shirt, said Prof. Blevins, a zoo volunteer, and the hat. And my wife would borrow those things to have photographs made of her students.
Yes.
We took them to Bowen Ranch.
Yes.
So they were learning about ranch and what a ranch is about. That's the field trips, the things that are so good.
Yes.
How did you find that in this progress of your growth in the program?
Sure. So one of the things that we're doing, like Hillside Elementary School, which is where our deaf and hard of hearing program is for our region. Now remember, we're serving Anthony to Van Horn, so we're serving all of El Paso County, Hudspeth County, and Culberson County as well.
There were a few times my wife went as far as Marfa.
Yes.
To service someone once a month, go and service someone in Van Horn or Marfa.
Yeah, so those areas have hired their own teacher, so now we only go to Van Horn.
Okay.
But I mean, Van Horn is still a 2-hour drive.
Oh, yeah.
Each way, right?
Right.
So we still serve all 3 of those counties. So, kids are coming in from lots of locations. So, it's a pretty big area that we're serving, but we do want to make sure that they're all going to Hillside. So every kid is going to Hillside Elementary School that's using sign language. And at Hillside, we have a grant. It's called Eyes for Independence. We've been getting the grant for well over 20 years. And we do things like go to Pumpkin Patch and go to all these different activities. We take the city buses. The kids go and they learn how to order food, how to do all these things on their own. That's a very important skill that they have to do, is learn how to do it on their own, because there's not, in the real world, there's not always an interpreter or someone who's signing to you along the way. You have to be able to navigate the hearing world without the aid of that interpreter or someone who signs. So that's really our focus. So we have that grant, Eyes for Independence, for that. We do continue that at the middle school. Middle school is Ross Middle School, so we usually do some kind of field trip to Bassett, so that we learn how to cross Montana. Right. That's always scary for me as a program director. Montana's a very busy street, but we have to learn. That's something that our kids need to learn, is how to do that. They continue riding the city bus. We bring them actually to Burgess High School once a month. I do a lunch series with all the kiddos at Ross and Burgess, where we bring in all the different universities and colleges. I've brought either a guest speaker, or we do something through technology with Skype, or some kind of technology where we have someone talking to the kids about the different opportunities at colleges. Like we had Gallaudet, someone from Gallaudet come in, which is the four-year university from DC, specifically for deaf and hard of hearing. We had someone Zoom in, which is a type of technology from RIT, which is in Rochester, New York. We also had someone use through Sorensen, VRS services. Okay. They actually came. That we had them come in and talk about See Sun. That was actually. Was it this? Yeah, it was Tuesday. We did that on Tuesday.
I knew you were busy.
So we did that on Tuesday. I had EPCC come in, talk to the kiddos, UTEPs, because I want them to connect to local resources as well. But I really want to make sure that my middle and high school kids start thinking about college and universities early on, because I want them to make educated choices, right? If I never told them about it, well, that's on me. So as long as they have all that information out there, then they can start making their own choices and being those independent people that we want them to be.
That brings up another interesting. My profession has been political science and government. Doug Jackson, have you met Doug Jackson?
Yes.
Okay, and he became friends of ours a long time ago. He became a Disney scholar or something. They designated him, a great honor. And he began to ask me to come to Hillside and deal with Kids Vote.
Yes.
You've been to some of those assemblies and those programs where someone comes in. I would come in as Uncle Sam, and Doug would write a little script there, and we would go through this whole thing about what happens if you don't vote. Someone will take advantage of you. Mm-hmm. So mention that about the part of learning as a deaf person about government.
Sure. So we do a lot of government. Unfortunately, Mr. Jackson has retired. His last year, he was actually working at the Oral Deaf School at Bonham Elementary School.
Yeah, I did some for Bonham for him.
Yeah, so he worked with Oral Deaf, and he did mock trials there is what he did. So the kids actually went into the courthouse downtown, and they ran a trial. It was actually the trial of the Wicked Queen,
right,
for trying to poison and kill Snow White.
I had Doug and the judge in those cases on this program years ago, and that's fascinating to listen about how these kids get involved in it.
Yes, and so we had our kids, they're there, they're talking, they're using their different technologies, their cochlear implants, their hearing aids, all these different things there at the courthouse to communicate with the judge, to communicate with each other on the stand, all these different things that are going on language-wise, as well as learning about how government works.
Now, what are some things you would like to see done?
Sure.
That's creative. He did something very creative there.
Sure.
Have you thought about some things you've done or you would like to see done?
I would love, so right now we're serving, by state law, we must serve any child with a hearing loss. I also work with children with vision loss, but we must serve those two populations starting from identification. Mm-hmm. So usually that could be as early as 6 weeks of age. We do a lot of that work in the home currently, and I would like to see how we can expand those services, because research is showing us that the more intervention we can provide early on for these children, whether that be through sign language or through supports with their technologies such as cochlear implants, their bone conducting hearing aids, all these things that we can provide to them earlier, the better the outcomes are going to be later on in life. So the better services, the more service time we can get early on with that 0 to 3 population or 0 to 5 population, the better outcomes we can have as a community for our deaf and hard of hearing, as well as our visually impaired kiddos.
Now this puts a task on your shoulders about getting good diagnosticians in.
Yes.
It's very important. That's what Shanna and Linnell always stressed. We need good diagnosticians. They can decide who goes here, what level are they on, and moving on. Have you had that experience?
Well, diagnosticians are a piece of it, but it's really also speech therapists are a big component of of helping those families decide, is this kid going to be a child who's going to need more sign language supports? Is this child going to be someone who might be successful with oral deaf education using their technologies? A lot of that comes from their audiologist and their speech therapist and their it's really an interdisciplinary team at this point. We have ECI involved with our little ones, our 0 to 3 babies as well. They're providing case management. They're also providing some of that speech therapy or other therapies that they might have.
Well, where I get upset now is the state of Texas has been cutting back on some of these programs, ECI and some of the other programs that used to be supportive of these, and cutting back on some of the funding. Now, you have to be an advocate to try to get some of that money back in there.
Absolutely. In fact, the legislator just came back starting in January of this year. Private insurance companies were denying hearing aids for kids. So starting in January of this year in the state of Texas, now it is law that they cannot deny hearing aids to kids who need it for educational purposes, because they were saying, oh, you only have one side, you have a deaf, one side of your, you have, like, let's say your left ear has deafness, but your right ear doesn't. Well, they were denying hearing aids for that left ear.
Oh, no.
So that is something that's luckily the state has come in and talked about, and we now have legislation that the insurance companies can't do that, although, unfortunately, I'm sure that there are ways to work around that are being worked around that. But we have to advocate for those kids, making sure they get access to that technology, getting access to sign language supports. One of the biggest things that I'm seeing in our community is, because that identification is so important, who does that identification? It's the medical team in our city, and we are just very lacking in a lot of medical services when you only have one pediatric audiologist in a city the size of El Paso. Getting an appointment with her is difficult at times. Right. And so that identification, working with pediatric doctors, working with hospitals, working with all these different entities just for those parents to get that identification, or even the parents not realizing the importance of making those doctor's appointments or getting in to see those doctors, because there's a grieving process with learning that your child has a hearing loss as well. Oh, yeah. So all these different factors, I'm just seeing that we're not picking up kids as early as we could. Unfortunately, we've seen a decrease in our enrollment for our 0 to 3 our birth to 3 population here in the city. We should be seeing, the national average is about 3 in 1,000 births should have some form of hearing loss. When I went back and looked at the research, I think it went back, the most current data that we have is 2014, and there were about 14,000 births at the children's hospitals in El Paso County. So when you're looking at 14,000 births in El Paso County, that's about 42 kids that we should be picking up every single year, and we're serving less than 40 currently as an entire region. So
that's where you also get into the social services organizations that are out and about, and they can alert you to someone that's not being served that needs to be served.
Yes, if they're getting there, that's always the key. So finding kids is always the key, and that's a huge part of what I'm trying to do, is how can we get all these different entities in El Paso to work together to get the ECI services, to get the services for students that need them, that have a hearing loss or a vision loss, right? Those are huge components of Child Find, which is, and in the state of Texas, again, a free appropriate education. Free and appropriate education, it says, for students with hearing and vision loss, starts at birth.
Well, a lot of the families that Shannon and I'll work with, and you've worked with, they're not aware of some social programs and financial programs that are there.
Absolutely.
Because some of you have to go with them to Social Security offices and work on Social Security disability issues, and sometimes these people are taken advantage of.
Absolutely. Or don't have access to health care, don't even know that they need to sign up for certain health care. So when you say, oh, I need you to go see this audiologist, or I need you to go see this ophthalmologist, or I need you to see, an ENT, they don't think, how am I going to see that person? Because they say, well, I don't have the health care, I don't have the insurance to do that. So first, it's connecting those families to some of those entities and some of those organizations that can help them get on some kind of waiver or some kind of information to get those evaluations or procedures done as well.
Exactly. Well, we have a few more minutes. Any other things that you're thinking that you'd like to see implemented?
Sure. I think that one of the things that, as I'm looking as a region, it's transforming. The world of deaf education is transformed. We really need to stay focused on, what is best for each individual child, and not so focused on different philosophies, whether that be oral deaf education, signing deaf education. You know, in the schools we use signed English versus ASL. We try to incorporate a little bit of ASL for, you know, for whole language development. So that's my biggest thing is a lot of times in deaf education we get so bombarded with philosophy that I think that we forget what it is that that child needs, and we have to really look at the whole child and say, you know what, maybe they need a piece of all the different philosophies.
The real world.
The real world.
I want to give a couple of minutes here at the end for Lanil and Shanna to be seen from that previous program, talking about the beginnings of it. Appreciate you coming.
Thank you so much.
We're going to clip that in, and then we'll follow with the credits. And I love the program. I love the kind of work that all of you do. Thank you very much.
Thank you, thank you.
When I can remember when you really got active in fighting for rights. You know when that was? That was back when you were working with these deaf children, and you were taking some of their families and parents to get registered with certain social programs that could assist them and help them and so on. And so you were going to Austin and testifying with regard to funding for the programs and fighting for the rights for the programs. So in that case, you were fighting for human and civil rights. You want to talk about that?
Well, at that time, there was a movement on in the United States to do a better job of educating deaf children. And we were so glad it was called to attention by the Department of Education. And we didn't want to be left behind. And other states had some things we didn't, though Texas was always fortunate enough to have a school for the deaf. But when they decided to have regional day schools for the deaf, and one was established here in El Paso to handle all 9 counties, and I opened the first preschool. And as it grew, then Shanna joined me and was also in the preschool with me. But we lacked other things. We had a preschool and an elementary, but we didn't have a junior high, a senior high, or a parent-infant program. And the public schools worked with us, and we got the junior high and the senior high. And I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Mr. LaForelle, who was always, he was an assistant superintendent, and the deaf school was in his area, and he was absolutely wonderful to us and was a real leader in educating handicapped children. And then when we started, we wanted a birth to 3 program. That's when we testified. We were lacking in that,
and the federal law came out that said a deaf child should be educated from birth through 21. Well, that meant that we lacked the program, the birth to 3 program. And so that's when we went and testified before the Senate in order to obtain that kind of a program.
Well, eventually, the Aid for Dependent Disability people, the Disability Act was passed, and there were some people at this demonstration that were on that issue.
That's right.
Because Donald Trump in the campaign had made fun of a disabled man.
That's right. That definitely was mentioned in the march. And there were, we didn't want Texas, at that time, we didn't want Texas to lag behind other states in the education of 0 to 3 children. And we testified before the legislature, and when a committee came out here, we testified, and some of the parents testified. And my husband took me to Austin, and I personally called on everybody that was on that committee. I knocked on every door and told them how drastically we needed the funding, because you know, the Texas legislature is kind of famous for passing things and not funding them.
Yes.
And we wanted to make sure that it got funded. And we worked hard, and so did other teachers and parents across Texas. By then, the regional day schools were established, and we had a network with which to work.